Good evening, everybody. We are now in our final segment, our final episode, as it were, of the ongoing series, Stories of Orthodox America. And we have thus far, and we are now coming, the topic this week is the emerging American church, the 40s through the 90s, and actually 1994 in particular, and then setbacks, new immigration, and converts going into the present day. But we want to just briefly review where we've been. We've been through the early history of the North American church, which centered on Alaska primarily. That was up into the 1860s. In week 2, we looked at developing missions and mass immigration. Huge number of stories in that period of time and massive immigration. In week 3, last week, we looked at the Russian Revolution, World War I, chaos in the aftermath of all of that. We even used Matthew Namie's 9 years that almost destroyed the Orthodox Church, kind of that little rubric of looking at the years that were really tough for the church across the world, including America. And then retreat, the years of retreat, where the church is kind of on a survival footing, not only in America, but also especially in the communist lands, right? Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, there's mass killings, there's all kinds of terror happening around the world. And all kinds of challenges both here and abroad for Orthodoxy. So we're now here. We did the scream last week. The good news is this week there's not so many screams. The news is not as bad from the 1940s on, believe it or not. So we have some basic events happening here. 1951 for the Orthodox Church in America, at least this is very important. Father Alexander Schmemann leaves Paris for America to become the head of St. Vladimir Seminary, replacing the wonderful George Florovsky, who had been dean before him. But he begins a new period of Orthodox America, at least for those of us in the OCA and the Antiochian Church. By the way, why is he important for the Antiochians as well as the OCA? Anyone know why? Where do Antiochians send their seminarians to go study? St. Vladimir's, usually. Traditionally, they would go to St. Vladimir's. Only recently would they go to St. Tikhon's too, and they might go to Holy Cross. So we have, by the 30s, we have 3 seminaries in America, but Father Schmemann not only is a big influence on the OCA, but also in the Antiochian Church as well. Father Tom Galloway famously said Schmemann was worth the price of attendance at St. Vlad's back in the early 80s and late 70s. So, okay, Father Schmemann as a young man, he was born in Estonia, between the wars, came to Paris between the wars, grew up in France with his wife, whom I knew really well, and that eventually came to America in part because the church he saw in France was stuck in the past, and he wanted a church that was looking to build for the future, and that's why he came here. In 1959, a big year for the Orthodox. Archbishop Yakovos becomes the Greek Archbishop of America. And he's an incredibly important figure for the 20th century. He was born in Constantinople, a real Constantinopolitan Greek from the Greek community, a very cultured, brilliant, strong leader. He was very close to the OCA, the Metropolia, which then became the OCA, very close to the Antiochians. He worked very well with the other jurisdictions. He also, though, could deal with the Greeks, and so he was able to kind of be all things to all people. And he could also navigate the politics back in the Fanar. And the Fanar is the term for what? What is the Fanar? I don't have that in my slide. The Fanar is the neighborhood in Constantinople where the Patriarch of Constantinople resides. So it's the ecumenical patriarchate compound area. And it's a broader neighborhood too. And the Greeks were centered there in the city. And they're often called Fanariotes or Fanarians. And so that was a way to identify Greeks of the old capital city, and he was one of them. But he was quite a visionary. He recognized early on the evil of racism and had no problem marching with Dr. Martin Luther King when most Protestants would not be seen with him. But there was the Archbishop of the Greek Church there in the middle of it all. And he served faithfully until the mid-90s, and only dying about 10 years ago. At the same time, we have in the OCA, the Metropolia, this is before the OCA is the OCA. From the 50s on, we have Metropolitan Leonti Turkevich. And I have a slide about him later, but he's our leader in the OCA, a very important figure. He was the product of a spiritual child of St. Tikhon, the patriarch. So he was from that milieu. He had served in America as a missionary priest with his family, and he had gone back to Russia, participated in the All-Russian Council of 1917, a very important role he played, but eventually came back to America. His wife passed away, and they made him bishop. And so he was eventually made the Metropolitan of the Metropolia, and he's reputed to be a saint. There are lots of stories about him. My favorite one, by a friend of mine, walked on him once, levitating in prayer. And apparently he'd do this. He'd get lost in prayer and would be found floating around the chancery. I don't know, but these are stories you hear, lots of weird stories about him, but all of them are like holy man stories. So he might be canonized in the next decade or two. So also, along that time period, when Iakovos is the Archbishop of the Greeks and Metropolitan Leonti is head of the Metropolia, we have a new massive immigration. You remember in 1924, the federal government tightened the immigration policy. There was a flood before World War I. Between the wars, there was less of a flood. And then after the war, in the 60s, especially with the chaos politically in Greece, there's various revolutions and juntas and stuff happening. Greeks pour into America, and there's a re-Hellenization of the GOA that happens in that time. That's an important moment. In the 60s, 62, Father Seraphim Rose converts to Orthodoxy, becomes a very important figure for converts, and also for processing the Orthodox tradition in a critical way that also takes us back to its roots. So he's very important. Just as Father Schmeman's important for Orthodox America, so Father Seraphim Rose is also important, but in a different key, you might say. We'll mention him more later. In the 60s, also, we have 1966, Metropolitan Philip Saliba succeeds the wonderful Metropolitan Anthony Bashir to be head of the Antiochian Church. And Metropolitan Philip builds on Metropolitan Anthony's great foundation. These were both men who could have been president of Lebanon had they stayed. They're from elite families, very bright, strongly formed men who could have done many things. They chose to serve the church. And Metropolitan Philip used his charisma to unite the Antiochians finally from two jurisdictions into one, and began to build a very strong archdiocese for the Antiochians. And arguably, they still have the strongest organization of all the Orthodox jurisdictions in terms of just functioning well. And that was the foundation of Metropolitan Anthony and the Metropolitan Philip, who was the Antiochian Metropolitan until about 12 years ago when he finally died. So that's almost 50 years he was head of the Antiochian Church in North America. And he does a lot of important things, as you'll see. 1966 is the year that the largest Orthodox event in American history happened. There was 150 priests and tens of thousands of young adults and youth. I believe it was in Pittsburgh. It filled up a stadium in Pittsburgh. It was an incredible moment, and it reflected the desire in this year, 60s, right, for Orthodox to come together and be united. It was a groundswell kind of thing. And in this moment, before the massive immigrations of the later part of the 20th century, the Orthodox Church is becoming more American, more distinctly whatever is going on here. And the clergy being formed in our own seminaries now for about 30 years. We have a sense of identity. Antiochians and the Metropolia are cross-pollinating. The Greeks get along well with everybody. The only ones not playing ball really is Rokor. But everyone else is getting along pretty well in common unity. And so this is a reflection in 1966 of that kind of unity from the ground up with the young people. It's also around the time that English begins to take over kind of gradually across most of the jurisdictions. Metropolitan Anthony Bashir and Metropolitan Philip both pushed English very strongly, more than even the Metropolia bishops did. In the year 1966, 69, when Bishop Dimitri is ordained a bishop in the Metropolia, that's the bishop that founded this parish. When he's ordained, he told me once, I asked him about Russian and English. He said, I'm bad at Russian. Because I had to learn it. I said, okay, great, you had to learn it. Why? He said, because the synod meetings were in Russian in 1969. And if you wanted to participate, you had to know Russian. And that's not that long ago. And the OCA synod, even when it was the OCA, for a couple years was in Russian, not in English. So that tells you something. Anyway, so this moment is interesting. Bishop Dimitri's consecrated the first convert bishop in North America. He ordained me as a deacon, and he was the founding bishop of our diocese. He was a convert to Orthodoxy back in the 20s, I believe. He had been born a little bit after World War I. He was a teenager, I think 13, and he and his older sister. He took the name Dimitri. She took the name Demetria, or Dimitra, and they had to learn Greek to be baptized because the only church around was the Greek Orthodox Church in Dallas. They learned Greek, but he always had a desire to minister to his native Texans. He's a Texan through and through, and so was she. And he ended up going to St. Vladimir Seminary. He became a priest under the Ukrainian church, interestingly enough. Eventually went under the OCA. There's a picture of him here baptizing the child of Lee Harvey Oswald, because Marina Oswald was a Russian Orthodox believer and went to his parish. At the very time that all the assassinations happening in Dallas, he's ministering to her and to her family. He loved her. She was a wonderful woman, he said. He has all these stories, of people he knew, bishops that have been long gone. He knew every bishop you can ever imagine. He was friends with Patriarch Alexei II. My favorite story of him and Patriarch Alexei II in the 90s, when Bishop Dimitri was already old, Patriarch Alexei had to have heart surgery in Miami, and went to Miami for the procedure. It was a renowned heart clinic there, and was the guest of Bishop Dimitri at our cathedral in Miami. And at the time, Bishop Dimitri had an apartment there. They stayed there together, and he cooked for Patriarch Alexei. And he said, "Your Holiness, after you have your heart surgery, what do you want to do? You're here to recover for like a month. What do you want to do?" And Patriarch Alexei said, "I have 2 dreams while I'm in America. 2 dreams of things I want to do. Number 1, I want to eat an American steak. And number 2, I want to go on a speedboat like in Miami Vice." And so Bishop Dimitri took him out for the best steak in town after his heart was getting better. And then they got on a speedboat. And I'm sure they were probably dressed rather casually, but I have this image of the white Klobuchar, with the veil flowing in the wind and Miami Vice. But it's interesting, Patriarch Alexei fell in love with our American way. He commented that he loved the lunch and the coffee hour after liturgy. And every Sunday he would be there visiting with the parishioners. Just a normal kind of person, and there's still very sharp memories, good memories of his visit to Miami back in the early 90s, right after communism fell. But Bishop Dimitri has all these kind of stories. He passed away in 2011 after many, many years of faithful ministry. When he began the Diocese of the South in 1979, we had 6 parishes. When he died, we had about 70, and now we have 80 or 90 parishes. So the fruit of his work is manifold, and we'll say more about him later. So his ministry begins in the late 60s, coinciding with almost the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America. Now just to back up a bit, that's a very interesting story, because you remember after the revolution, the patriarch kind of sends word to everyone, fend for yourselves. He blesses Metropolitan Platon to be the head of the church in America and says, "God bless you. We'll talk to you soon." And there was never any more talking after that, because the patriarch died not long after. And then there was a period of no patriarch in Russia, and the church was just completely on its knees with very few bishops functioning. And we were fending for ourselves. Functionally, we were autocephalous in that period of time. Really from 1920 on, what we are here, the Metropolia, now the OC, was functionally autocephalous. We were fending for ourselves. But beginning in the 50s, we realized, as part of this whole movement of what is Orthodoxy going to do in America, we're all becoming a little more American. The church is evolving a bit, adapting to being here, and we believe we're called to be here. What would that look like? And so the desire was to have one church in America, one common structure, and to have an autocephalous church in America, which means that rather than have to go, for example, the Antiochians, just to give you an example, the Antiochians are not autocephalous. They have some degree of autonomy in their North American context, but whenever they want to elect a new metropolitan, they can't do that themselves. They nominate candidates, and there's a process, and there's a nomination that happens at their assembly, nationwide assembly, and then the names go to Damascus for consideration. And then the patriarch of Antioch will, with his synod, will elect a new metropolitan for North America, and certain decisions are run through Antioch. And that's what an autonomous church or a subordinate church would do. An autocephalous church has no such tie. The autocephalous church has its own primate, and it's literally autocephaly means self-heading. They elect their own head. The head is not approved by any other churches. The only thing that would be approval would be intercommunion. So like, if Metropolitan Tikhon would be heretic, and we elect him primate of the OCA and he's a heretic, then they could excommunicate him, but they can't deny him that he's our metropolitan, right? And thank God there's no church right now that we're not in communion with at present in the OCA, which is a blessed thing given how crazy the Orthodox world is right now. But that being, in 1960s, we wanted to find a home. We wanted autocephaly, we wanted one church in America. There were some problems. We could not get everyone together. And by we, I don't mean the OCA people. I mean, just it wasn't time yet for the churches to come together. There wasn't the grace to do that. And we even went to the Russians and said, please help us. And they said, go talk to the Greeks. And so we went to the Greeks, and the Greeks said, we can't help you, go talk to your mother church, the Russians. So they literally shipped us back and forth, didn't know where to put us. And finally the Russians agreed to take us on, not as a subordinate church, because we did not want to be subordinate to Moscow during the Cold War. That's not a good idea. And in general, they realized we want to chart our own course. But the deal was we would recognize Moscow as our mother church, and Moscow would in turn recognize our church as autocephalous, but not with an exclusive autocephaly, which is unusual. Normally autocephaly is exclusive in a region. So there's a tomos, or a constitution, you might say, that's delivered by a mother church or by the ecumenical patriarchate, one of the two, and that tomos delivers kind of a mandate. So for instance, when the ecumenical patriarch gave a tomos of autocephaly to Poland, I believe after the war, and that tomos said, you are the Church of Poland, here are your boundaries. The metropolitan of your city, of your church, is in Warsaw, and there's these people, this area he serves. Here are his prerogatives. He may make chrism, he may do these things. I don't know what the details are, but there's a tomos, and within that boundary, he exercises primacy, and that is the Church of Poland. Our tomos was different in that it recognized that we are functionally autocephalous, but that we coexist with other jurisdictions that are not part of the OCA, but that are also canonical churches. So it's a very unique tomos, the only one given in history like that, which is part of its beauty and part of its controversy. And the other thing about that is, there's a debate within Orthodoxy does the mother church give the tomos, or does the ecumenical throne give the tomos? And that actually has been a debate for the last couple centuries, and it's not really clear in Orthodox history. The ecumenical patriarch would say absolutely only the EP can give it, and the Russians and other churches might maintain, like the Serbs actually just gave autocephaly to the Macedonian church. They did that on their own recognizance without consulting Constantinople. Constantinople, then they issued their own tomos right after that, and so I don't know which one counts, but regardless, the Macedonian church, I believe, is now autocephalous. So, but there's the debate. So, and that's part of the controversy. This is Patriarch Pimen, when he was still Metropolitan Pimen. He was giving the autocephalous tomos to Bishop Theodosi, who became 10 years later Metropolitan Theodosius of the OCA. So that document was given in 1970 and becomes an important, if you will, kind of framework for what's happened in the Orthodox Church of America since. And we'll talk about the OCA's promises and failures in a little bit, because there's some good news and bad news about the OCA. The one bad thing I would say about it immediately is the Greeks were like, everything's great with Metropolia. The moment the Russians gave us autocephaly, the Greeks didn't like it. It became a source of bitterness between the Greek church and the OCA. It never hampered communion, but there's always been a sense of like real reservation about that from the Greeks in particular, more than any other jurisdiction. Okay, so 1970 also, the year of autocephaly, St. Herman is canonized. Interestingly enough, we're not communing with ROCOR, but we're communicating about the canonization, and we canonize him simultaneously, which is kind of interesting. So there's all these little connections all the way around. And of course, Father Seraphim Rose and Father Alexander Schremen and Bishop Dimitri were all very involved in this process of canonizing St. Herman, recognizing the sanctity the people in Alaska saw in him for all those years, declaring what they believed was true as part of the church life. So this is the first All-American Council held at St. Tikhon's in their gymnasium. You can still go there. In the gymnasium, that's the first gathering of the AAC, the All-American Council. Before that, they were known as the All-American Sobors, and Sobor is a Russian word for council. And we distinguish the pre-autocephalous time of the Metropolia from the autocephalous time by calling the old councils Sobors and the new ones All-American Councils, just so you know. It's kind of interesting. And that's Bishop Dimitri there with the crown on at the canonization of St. Herman in 1970. So, 1972, Bishop Dimitri helped spearhead the creation of the Exarchate of Mexico, which allowed for an extension of the OCA to operate in Mexico. So and since then we've had a presence, an OCA presence in Mexico. We have an archbishop there in Mexico City named Archbishop Alejo, and we're very active in supporting the Mexican diocese as part of our church in America. We also, of course, have a Canadian archdiocese as well. And right now it's Bishop Irene of Ottawa who's in charge of the Canadian church. But again, both Archbishop Irene and Archbishop Alejo sit on the OCA Holy Synod, are fully part of the Orthodox Church in America. And when we gather in council, we have all the flags of those countries on the dais, representing kind of the collective heritage of our nations. 1979, two events happened. The repose of Righteous Mother Olga, who's just been canonized, in the process of finishing that canonization. And we also created the Diocese of the South as part of the All-American Council. I think that was the third All-American Council that year. That elected Metropolitan Theodosius, our primate. And the funny thing was, Bishop Dimitri won the popular vote at the council. But according to the rules, unless you have a two-thirds majority, if you get a two-thirds majority as to be Metropolitan, only one name goes to the Synod for confirmation. If you only get half, or a little more than half, then the top two names go. So as it was, Bishop Dimitri got about half, Bishop Theodosius had about a third, and there were a couple other candidates, and so the rule was both names were sent to the Synod. And the Synod elected Theodosius, not Bishop Dimitri, probably because Bishop Theodosius spoke Russian and could deal with the old Slavs, but Bishop Dimitri could not. So he was a convert, and they're like, we're not ready for a convert metropolitan yet, which is probably reasonable. But anyway, that's how much the church has changed since 1979. And in fact, it was the council before that, in 1974 or 5, when so it was the second OCA council, and people were singing in Slavonic, and the young people got really annoyed, and they started singing in English over the choir. And ever since then, everything in the AAC has been in English. But that's how it kind of happened. The people were involved, the young people especially, involved in pushing the church that way, and the bishops were kind of like, okay, we'll do this now, and that's how it went. So there's a lot of that happening in the church life throughout the history of Orthodoxy, but also in American church history too. Righteous Mother Olga here with her husband, who is a serviceman and postmaster. I hope if you haven't seen the movie Sacred Alaska, you get to see it. It's a great film. It's about her life and about Alaskan spirituality. She'll formally be canonized either later this year or next year. It'll be a very sacred celebration, and then she'll officially be on the calendar of the church. Okay, so 1982, big moment for the OCA because we changed the calendar. Before this, the Metropolia and the OCA were on the old Julian calendar that the Russian Church and Serbian Church and Mount Athos are still on. But in that year, we decided to make the change. But I'll tell you, it wasn't done very well. In Pennsylvania, in particular, this is Bishop Herman. He was Metropolitan Herman for many years later on in life, but he was the Bishop of Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania at that time, and the Synod made the change, and Bishop Herman was kind of, God rest his soul, was kind of a tyrant. And these poor people had just voted the year before to have Pennsylvania recognize Old Russian Christmas as a state holiday. So they'd done all that work for 20 years to recognize Russian Christmas, which we celebrated in the OCA. In the very year that it's made state law, the bishop changes the calendar. And just a contrast in pastoral styles, Bishop Dimitri had 2 parishes in Florida that held on to the old calendar. And he said, fine, do old calendar. It doesn't matter to me at all. I like the new better, but be on the old. It doesn't matter. Bishop Herman made every parish switch, and he lost a huge fraction of his parishes to ROCOR as a result. So we have, again, a lot of these stories of pastoral. My wife and I we said about him, he had the pastoral sense of a steamroller. Just kind of like he wasn't a bad man at all, but there was a sense of like not getting it sometimes. And we've suffered in the OCA over the years because of things like this. So I think it's a good contrast, Bishop Dimitri's approach versus Bishop Herman. So in 1985, what was the Greek Mission Center becomes the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, and it joins. It becomes part of the organization known as SCOBA. I didn't have that on here, but SCOBA is the Standing Council of Orthodox Bishops in America. SCOBA, Standing Council of Orthodox Bishops in America. It was founded in the 60s, and it kind of evolved as a voluntary organization for our hierarchs to get together. It was a very good organization. It was completely organic, and SCOBA established various ministries under its aegis. You'll see later on the Orthodox Christian Charities joins that. The OCMC joined that. Later on, you get the prison ministry, and now I think Focus North America. There are a number of ministries that transcend jurisdiction that are under the aegis of SCOBA and what later becomes the Assembly of Bishops, which we'll come to in a second. But anyway, important moment here for Orthodox missions, kind of raising awareness in America about the missionary DNA of our church, which we've always had, but sometimes it's forgotten or laid aside. 1987 is a very big year for the Antiochian church particularly, because in that year they received a large, I think about 10,000 members from what had been the Evangelical Orthodox Church, which was a body that came out of Campus Crusade ministries, initially in the 60s. In the 70s they began to make churches, and then in the late 70s they began to form the EOC, because they were reading about ancient Christianity and they realized you got to have Eucharist, you got to have church fathers, you got to have vestments, and you got to have liturgy. And so they started doing all these things piecemeal. And when they reached a certain critical mass of we're doing things that look Orthodox, they decided to become Orthodox, and they did that by self-consecrating themselves as bishops, which you can't do. And so they created a fake church, and they basically there was a Protestant kind of Orthodox movement, and they did this. And eventually, though, by the 80s, they realized they weren't really Orthodox, and they went looking around for a body to take them in. They talked to Father Schmemann. He actually visited them a lot, but they wanted to maintain their own autonomy within the OCA. And the OCA wanted them to be absorbed into our parish communities and become part of our family, as it were. The Greeks didn't give them the time of day, and the Antiochians were willing to cut a deal. And so they went to Metropolitan Philip, who was very, very gracious and visionary. He realized this was an opportunity. He didn't like that they were going to have their own property still, they had their own deaneries, kind of separate from the regular Antiochians. But he's like, this is going to work long term. And actually, in long term, it did work. But there was a lot of problems along the way. This was the initial group of EOC clergy before they joined the Antiochian Church with Metropolitan Philip. And there's the mass ordination. Metropolitan Philip didn't know what to do with them because there were so many guys becoming priests. He did a mass ordination, which I've never heard of before, but he was very enterprising, and we're going to do it. And he did it, and they were accepted as priests. We'll talk about some of the challenges here in a bit, but there were challenges that manifested a little bit later that will come into our timeline. Because remember, converts are crazy, right? We saw that in the 1880s and 90s, right? All those converts were disastrous. It's getting better, but there's still problems here. So, okay. 89, this is an interesting year. The Athonite elder Ephraim of the Holy Mountain begins work in America to build monasteries. And throughout the 90s, he travels around North America planting monasteries in a traditional Athonite fashion. And he was sort of controversial because at one point he left the Omophorion of the ecumenical patriarch, which he has care over Manathos, And Elder Ephraim for a while was in Rokor, which just tells you something, right? He was in Rokor, eventually came back to the ecumenical patriarch, but he was always a bit controversial with regard to being obedient to his bishop. So we'll come to that in a little bit. But he plants a lot of monasteries, and nowadays, if you go to a Greek monastery, except for St. Gregory Palamas and a couple others, almost every Greek monastery in America was planted directly by Elder Ephraim. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. I got to meet him, by the way, in 1999. Of blessed memory now. He died about 10 years ago. IOCC is established, International Orthodox Christian Charities, which is a very good organization. They're really excellent. And then in 1994, we celebrated the bicentennial of the Russian mission in America, which for the OCA is our 200th anniversary as a coherent church body. And lots and lots of stuff happening, especially with regard to the Diocese of Alaska, which is still, by the way, called the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Alaska, and they're still on the old calendar, and the natives still do about 1/3 of the liturgy in Slavonic, 1/3 in native language, and 1/3 in English. So it's a very different Orthodox experience than the lower 48 to this day. And the natives like it that way. They like it being different. And our seminary in Alaska, which was founded sometime in the 20th century, second half, St. Herman's, it offers a pretty good education, but it's a very unique, tailored education toward the environment of Alaska. A lot of distance, a lot of having to make do, a lot of bivocational skills, because most of the priests have to have some kind of a job, including alcohol abuse training, things like that plague some of the native populations. So anyway, I recommend Bishop Alexei of Alaska has a fantastic talk on the Alaskan church. If you ever want to, I can just send it to you. It's great. It's the challenges of, he gives a history of Orthodoxy in Alaska, and it's really heart-wrenching. We only touched upon the early parts of it here, but there were some terrible times for the Alaskan church, and he tells the story, and also how we can support them now going forward. Okay. So why is 1994 possibly a watershed moment in American Orthodox history? It's not because of the bicentennial. What happened in 94 that's very, very important for Orthodox history? Not Bill Clinton, not Monica Lewinsky, not the UN.
Was that the year that all the bishops got together? Yeah.
It was the year of the Ligonier Conference. Which Ligonier, does anyone know what Ligonier is? Yeah, that's a reformed word. The conference center was actually a reformed conference center, and the Antiochans bought it, staffed it up for a good deal, and they turned it into essentially their, not a headquarters, but it's the center of Antiochian Orthodoxy now, is this beautiful camp we call it Ligonier, but it's the Antiochian village. And at the Antiochian village in 94, Metropolitan Philip, again the visionary, hosted all the bishops of America at his conference center. And the goal was very simple: to unite the Orthodox together. This was going to happen. He was ready. In fact, Metropolitan Theodosius, our metropolitan, so you see the big three in the middle. You have Iakovos in the middle, the Greek bishop. He's getting old there. Metropolitan Philip over there, and then Metropolitan Theodosius, OCA, Antiochians, and the Greeks, working together. And they wanted to do this. And Metropolitan Theodosius even said, I will resign my primacy and give you all my prerogatives if we can unite. That's kind of where things were. That's how good things were in that moment. And the bishops, I think, were ready to go. What happened? The ecumenical patriarch intervened. And he retired Iakovos like that, put him out to pasture, and made sure that no union could happen. It's a really shocking thing for a lot of the bishops who were there, and certainly the clergy and laity who were supporting this. And in a sense, Orthodoxy never recovered from this moment in terms of Orthodox unity. This was the high water mark. One high water mark was that youth rally in the 60s. Another is this moment in 94 at Ligonier when the bishops are ready to go. And then from the mother countries, the kibosh is put on this effort. So, I mean, it's just an important moment and a very sad moment, perhaps, in our history. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew was the one who made that decision. And things begin to unravel in certain parts of the country. The EOC movement encounters its first major challenge. In 98, there's a revolt of several parishes out in the West along the lines of traditionalism. This is Father Hardenbrook. He's the son of one of the EOC bishops. His father was actually a ringleader of this schism, and it had to do with priests wearing cassocks, because Philip liked to wear clerical suits, and his style was very kind of business oriented, and he was a great man, but also very practical. And he just kind of rolled his eyes at these people who wanted to. They got rid of all the pews. They made things really traditional, and the services would be hours long, and they're converts trying to be more Orthodox than Jesus. And the Metropolitan Philip got angry, and he told them to stop. And then they said, "We're not going to stop because we're right and you're wrong." It's all that kind of stuff. We're doing the rubrics perfectly. You're a modernist. And anyway, all this is happening. And it blows up in 1998. And I was actually at the college conference in 99 with kids who were from the rump parish that was left. Because he and his father took most people out of the Antiochian Archdiocese. And they took cover under the Jerusalem Patriarchate. Somehow, someone in Jerusalem took them in and gave them a parish and blessed them to be under the omophorion of some bishop in Palestine. And eventually it got our result. I think now this parish is part of the GOA, ironically. It got sorted out over time, but yeah, it created a huge scandal at the moment, and it had to do with these fault lines of modernism, traditionalism, etc. So, and there were other examples of that happening all around the country. That was the big Ben Lomond was the big one, right? So 1990s big challenges for leadership in the GOA, with Bishop Iakovos sidelined. They bring in a firebrand from Greece who doesn't know America at all, and like Bishop Spiridon, and he was a disaster. Like he mismanaged things, and he couldn't do what Bishop Iakovos did. And within 2 years, he is suspended and shipped back to the old country. But in the meantime, he brought over Elder Ephraim, blessed him to expand monasteries. Now you have Ephraimite monasteries everywhere, and there's a tension oftentimes between the Episcopal leadership of the GOA and these monastics with the Ephraimites, and they're at odds. I never forget, there is a parish that has been called, by Greeks I know, the most dysfunctional Greek parish in America. I served there twice as a supply priest. I won't say where it was, but it's notorious for being dysfunctional. And Greeks would tell me this. And what the bishop would do is he would send in a priest who was very modernist, kind of like, clean shaven, would wear a clergy suit, wasn't really into monasticism very much, and he'd be the priest. And then the faction of the church that wanted the traditionalists would complain and harass the bishop until the bishop picked a new priest. So then they'd ship him off, and they'd bring in an Ephraimite priest, a guy with a long beard and 30 kids or something, and they go back and forth. They have the guy with the beard and the guy without a beard and it was like whiplash. And these poor people. They came to me once because some of them knew me, like, what's going on with our church? Like, why is it like this? It really is a function of late 20th century, early 21st century American Greek Orthodoxy, but it spills over into Orthodoxy more broadly. But you have this dichotomy happening sometimes, and the Greeks were like the epicenter of that. In part because again, it goes back to Metaxakis with the whole old calendars thing. The monks tended to be sympathetic to the old calendars. Athos itself is on the old calendar still, even though it's under the EP. But then the bishops became more anti-monastic because the monks were rebelling against their authority. So you have this no-win scenario where everyone's mad and everyone's frustrated. And that spilled over. And this time now, this spills over into America because now we have the Ephraimites here. So anyway, it's very interesting. It's also very challenging. I told the story once, though. So the Ephraimites are also big on the canons, and you have to be really careful when you go to their monasteries. I think they're wonderful people, but they have a very strict edge. I had a friend who confessed, I think probably a very minor sexual thing, but the priest, the monk, who was a young monk, gave him a penance of no sexual relations with his wife for 3 years. And there's that kind of zeal with some of these guys that doesn't reflect a mature kind of parish ethos maybe. And we can if we were to quote the canons to each other, we'd all be defrocked and we'd all be unable to take communion for years, right? And so there's this kind of weird, I don't know what it is, but there's something in that I think is dangerous. And I tend to tell people I don't bless you to go make confession at Ephraimite monasteries because of this. I've seen pastoral malpractice coming out of that before. So I'm not saying they're bad people, maybe they're all saints, but there's pastoral malpractice going on. And 90% of the monasteries of the Greek church in America are Ephraimite in their heritage, they're very different from Rokor monasteries, really different, or from OCA monasteries. Archbishop Iakovos, Bishop Spiridon, and then after his little interregnum of a couple of years that ended not too well, the ecumenical patriarch shipped in Demetrios, who was a wonderful bishop for the Greeks for many years, and he's retired now. And now they have Archbishop Elpidophoros. Okay, 90s, another flood of immigrants, this time from the Slavic world. And this is interesting because this is where the OCA ran into trouble. Because we were gearing up for American ministry from the 50s on, right? Totally focused. Our seminary, in fact, it was a big deal. Father Paul Laser, our mentor at St. Vlad's, loved Russian, loved Slavonic. But if you dared utter Slavonic in the chapel, he would look at you like you committed a mortal sin. And I asked him once, because he would tell me quietly Russian proverbs under his breath. And we'd laugh together. It was great. But I asked him, I said, why are you so anti-Russian, even though I know you love Russian stuff so much? And he said, because we must be American to Americans. This is who we are. This is our vision. For him and that's part of the OCA's thing. In the 90s, though, we were unable to cope, and we're still unable to cope with the flood of immigrants because very few of our priests were trained in Slavic stuff. So, I'm kind of a weirdo in the OCA. I actually speak Russian, but I'm in the minority. And part of what changed Rokor from being an outlier, if you will, a pariah jurisdiction, was they got all these Slavs that came into Rokor that transformed Rokor. So now Rokor is not a bunch of Tsarist white Russians and their grandchildren. Now it's new Russians, people from the Soviet Union who they like Slavonic, and Rokor can provide Slavonic because they kept all that. So Rokor has been able to, and I think it's a good thing actually, Rokor has been able to minister to Slavs because of that connection closer to the Russian Slavic heritage. So that was been challenging for OCA, but also a good time for the Russian church abroad. And in fact, it is that influence that led Rokor back in union with Moscow in 2007. That's part of why it happened. And if you talk to the old Russian priests, they'll tell you this. It's very interesting. Okay. Oh, there's Rokor's Jordanville Monastery. Beautiful place. 2002, St. Athanasius is founded. That's not a red letter date, but for us it's important. There's our founding group, 2002. And then in the 2000s, there were major challenges in the OCA. We call this Time of Troubles 1, because in this time period, Metropolitan Herman was our leader, and there were some questions about money being misplaced. And part of it's unclear to me is whether it was criminal or whether it was people just being stupid. For example, I know stories of a priest who would take money, OCA money, to Moscow in the 90s. People are hungry in Moscow in the early 90s. He'd take over money from the church, tens of thousands of dollars, and just pass it out to people, like church bishops and priests and lay people, to help them. But there was no accounting of that money. And so you can't run a church like that. And so in the 2000s, all that caught up with us. And we still don't know yet how much of that was just not being wise and how much it was actual someone stealing things. But in the end, the Metropolitan resigned, and his chancellor was defrocked as part of that entire crisis we had. It was a big crisis in my early ministry. 2007, the Rokor schisms healed with Moscow, and now everything's sort of hunky-dory, sort of. 2008, Metropolitan Jonah is elected to heal the time of troubles after the resignation of Metropolitan Herman. But he's the youngest bishop on the synod, has no experience, and his tenure is very, very difficult for the OCA. And we call that Time of Troubles 2. So his reign from 2008 to 2012 was tumultuous, in part because he was very close to the Russian church, and he liked the Russian church a lot. He wanted the OCA to get back under Moscow. That was part of what he wanted. And the OCA didn't want that. And so we had a leader pushing us one direction, and the bishops and the clergy and the laity are not wanting to do that. And you can't lead if people won't follow you. And so there were other issues with him too, but he's a fine person. I'm still friends with him, but like his leadership was not a calm time for the Orthodox Church in America. And he resigned in 2012. So this block of time here was difficult. That was my entire young priesthood. My first 10 years of ministry was all in that period of time, with only a couple respite periods in there. So anyway, 2012, Metropolitan Tikhon's elected. Breathe a sigh of relief. I'll be honest with you. Well, here's, by the way, Metropolitan Theodosius, of blessed memory. Metropolitan Herman, of blessed memory. They're both wonderful people. I think they had some problems administrating. The Synod of Bishops back in the early years, Bishop Peter was my canon law teacher. This guy got defrocked, sorry. Bishop Nikon, of blessed memory, was our caretaker bishop. Part of why, you hear me talking about how much I love Bishop Nikon, he was the guy that helped hold my hand through all this, when all this was happening. And so he was very kind to me and my wife. He was a man of utmost integrity. And in fact, he and Bishop Job, of blessed memory, were the two bishops that steered our church through this difficult time and led us to the election of Metropolitan Tikhon. So I feel like complete love and respect for these two especially, because they were wonderful, holy hierarchs of our church. Here's the healing of the Rokor Schism. Patriarch Alexei, he's the one that had the stake and the speedboat. That was him. And that's him and the Metropolitan Laris of Rokor making up, after so many years of schism. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And then Metropolitan Jonah, elected there, served for 4 years as our primate. And then in 2011, right before the election of Metropolitan Tikhon, Bishop Dimitri died. He died in that year. And that's him. At his funeral, I was there. And yeah, it was a very blessed time. And then Metropolitan Tikhon's elected in 2012 and has served for the last 12 years as our primate quite beautifully, I think. There he is in 2014. I look a little younger. And 2016 was a big year for Orthodoxy around the world. That was the year that the Ecumenical Patriarch called the council in Crete. And that council was designed to address some of these questions, like how do you do autocephaly? Rules about priests and their families. Can priests remarry if they get divorced? Or if their wife dies? Different questions like that. Questions of ecumenical relations. Questions about reception of converts. These kind of questions were taken up by the council. But the work was not very good, and it read like a UN document, I'm just saying. So I wasn't well received by the bishops. And unfortunately, the Russian patriarch didn't show up. He was mad about a couple things. And the Georgian patriarch didn't show up, I believe, and one other. These are the ones that are there. And of course, they didn't invite the OCA, because they view us, the ecumenical throne views us as a metropolia of the Russian church. That's how we're viewed. So when he receives us as part of the Russian church. That's how he thinks of us. So anyway, but part of the canonical church, just not autocephalous. So you had all the autocephalous primates were invited. Some didn't show. And when that happened, it created a huge conflict between the ecumenical throne and the Russian church that had already been simmering for a long time. And a lot of what's happened since then with Ukraine revolves around hurt feelings and the problems of this council. So I don't think it was a terrible thing. It just wasn't a very well-received council. And in the end, it goes down not as a heretical council, but simply as not important, probably. It's a conference or something. It's like not worth writing about. But he wanted this to be the 8th ecumenical council, right? But the problem, even people that were sympathetic to the patriarch said the problem with this council was there was no, in every other council there's a burning problem that has to be addressed by the world episcopacy, right? By all the bishops of the world. And there was not one burning, there were lots of little problems, but no burning problem that was dividing the church out. And so, weirdly, by calling the council, it might have made things worse. And that's one assessment. And the years after, the Ecumenical Patriarch formed from 2 schismatic bodies what we think is a fake church in Ukraine, a church that's not really authentic because the bishops weren't actually ordained properly. That's the position of over half the world's bishops. that these are not real bishops that have been ordained, and now he communes with the Church of Ukraine. But unfortunately, there's already an Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Metropolitan Onufry, who has been the lawful primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox community since 2014. And that was at the Atlanta AAC. He was our guest. I met him there. And he's been serving for 10 years in that capacity. And 90% of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine look to him for leadership. But unfortunately, this was a way of like sticking it to the Russians. And then the Russians invade and all hell breaks loose. So it's all these things, and in both cases of the Russian church and the case of the Greek church, there are state actors that are influencing and trying to manipulate what the churches are doing, which is just the way, I'm just telling you what it is. So these are challenges that the Orthodox Church faces in the world. Okay, so what are the main challenges facing Orthodoxy today? I want to just end with some of these challenges, because they're challenges you saw starting in episode 2, 3, and then, of course, tonight. Endemic jurisdictional conflict. This is a major problem in Orthodoxy. And frankly, it's been a problem in Christian history since the Corinthians. You've had questions of, this actually was a problem in the 2nd century with Rome and other bishops. And this is not a new problem, but it's a problem that we feel acutely right now because of the diasporas that have gone around the world. Greeks moving to America, Russians moving to America, Antiochus, and now we're all cohabitating, and we're trying to make church life work and to care about each other, but also realizing that the Orthodox canon state that a healthy church has one bishop in one city, not 3 in one city or 5. So there's this conflict, both in America from our jurisdictions, which again are worse today than they were in the 90s. And there's also conflict on the international stage between the two strongest poles of Orthodoxy, which would be the Greeks with the ecumenical throne and the Russians with Patriarch Kirill. And that they both have done things that I think are very sad and unfortunate. So this is but they're the two main people who speak for Orthodoxy in the world. That's where we are. So we have that. We also have problems between the church and state and how they relate to each other. And I note states because, there's the Russian state, there's the American state. The American state, the United States government has been close with the Greek church, the ecumenical patriarch, since the 40s. Because we view the ecumenical patriarch as a bastion against Soviet communism. And so we supported him very actively, and he supported us. And that's the State Department, CIA, all that's true, that's real. It doesn't make him illegitimate or bad, but it means that there's there's influence, and there's support, and there's relationships that go a long way back in our history, just as they go back in the Russian state with the Russian church and the Russian government. So, does the church bless war? I mean, these are related questions, right? War in Orthodoxy, what does that mean? How do we do all that? What does it mean to fight Orthodox people? These are problems and challenges we're facing right now in the world, and we have to be honest about that. There's a challenge of ethnodoxy, right? Where Orthodoxy is reduced to your nation, and we could do that in America. Be just focusing. OC could focus on Americans and neglect the other peoples that are in our midst, right? So this can manifest itself various ways. I once told the parish council here. When I got here, they told me they were very proud they were not ethnic. I said, oh no, you're as ethnic as any Greek church, but you're ethnically white-bread American. That's an ethnicity too. And so ethnodoxy can manifest itself as Greek, Hellenism, or as Americanism, or whatever. So this is always going to be a challenge, and we just have to be ready to think about it and reflect on it. Orthodox sectarianism, with converts on this end. There's, I could go on about this, but kind of, this is a trend starting really in the 1870s that it sort of stopped in the interwar period and then picked up again in the 60s. And ever since then, it's been a major problem for us. Now with the internet, it amplifies all of that. Even as we're reaching more people with Orthodox teaching, the challenge is these folks are reaching people too, and creating new grounds for sectarian kind of Orthodox-inspired sectarian theology. But Orthodox is not sectarian. But also, with converts, you have Orthodox, I call it accommodationism, where we're just trying to be like everyone else, be like the nations, whatever's cool and hip and normal, we're just going to fit with that, and those would be our values too. You find both of these things happening. I don't think with most Orthodox, but I think on the edges of Orthodoxy in America, these are challenges, and they impact our parishes. I've lost people in this parish on both sides of this, and it's really tough. Right, because I want everyone to be saved. My goal is everyone would be saved and all would be able to find a home in the church. That's what I want for our parish. And yet, there are challenges people have. They bring their baggage into the church, whether it's fundamentalism or sectarianism, or it's the culture, And so these are competing challenges on either side of our church life. All right, we're going to end with this. Saint of America, Saint Brendan. Feast day, May 16th. Higher Martyr Julie Valley, his companion, September 24th. Martyrs of Alaska. Peter the Aleut and St. Herman. St. Herman was the first to pray to St. Peter. He already was martyred. He said, Holy Martyr Peter, pray to God for us. St. Yaakov Mieczvatov. And we're going in order. This is when they died. You see, these are their death dates. Holy Hierarch Innocent. St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre, one of my favorites. Holy Hierarch Raphael of Brooklyn, 1915. When he dies, that's what the Antiochians begin to fragment. And that's the end. That's when the Russian mission begins to fall apart during World War I. St. John of Chicago, martyred the first day of the revolution in Russia after he'd been here for almost 20 years serving in America. Patriarch Tikhon, what a lovely photo of him. Patriarch Tikhon, who died after probably being poisoned, or at least being emotionally tortured for several years by the Bolsheviks. Holy Hierarch Anatoly, the new martyr of Irkutsk, he served as a young, he was widowed, and he became a monk then and became a priest in Alaska, served under St. Tikhon, and then eventually became a bishop, and then was martyred, I think, during the 30s, or 20s rather, sorry. He started our seminary in Minneapolis. The first seminary we had was in Minneapolis. And then it moved to Tenafly, New Jersey, and then became St. Vladimir's in 1938. Holy Hierarch Mardari Uskakovic. He was of Serbian origin, but labored in America very faithfully. He was friendly with the Russian metropolia, but when the war broke out, World War I, he couldn't get consecrated. They were going to consecrate him, but so the Serbs eventually did it themselves. And he was considered a very, very holy man, and he died in 1935. Much beloved by the Serbian community in Chicago. Higher Martyr Seraphim of Uglitch was a young missionary to America under St. Tikhon, eventually became a bishop, and then he was responsible for governing a large chunk of the Russian church, and the Bolsheviks said, if you don't cooperate, we're going to kill you, and there's no one to take your place. Who will lead the church after you? And he said, Jesus Christ will lead the church after me, and he got shot. Very holy man. Higher Martyr Alexander Kodovitsky of New York. He actually founded the parish that I did my first liturgy in New York. I love this parish. My wife and I visited there last year with our son. He was a great priest. He built about 12 parishes during his ministry in America. But his last position was being the dean, Kluchar, the dean of Christ the Savior Cathedral. And he was there when it got firebombed by Stalin. He was there at the very end. Imagine seeing all these things being destroyed. So he built these things his whole life, and now the church was being dismantled literally in front of him. And he was shot by the Bolsheviks during the Great Terror. Sebastian Dabovich was a Serbian American. He served under St. Tikhon for many years, and then after the revolution, he moved to Serbia to serve the Serbian church there and died in 1940. Higher Martyr Basil Martich of Poland served in Canada as a missionary priest, gathering the Russians together, kind of in that same spirit of St. Alexis Toth. But he was younger, of course, and he was killed by Poles, actually, because he was Orthodox and wouldn't get along with the Catholics. So anyway, martyred for his faith. St. Nikolai Žiča, a wonderful Serbian missionary bishop, who was in Dachau. There's a picture of him in Dachau. He wrote a lot of his best works in Dachau. And then because of communism, he could not return to Serbia, and so he was forced back into exile in America. and he spent his last years as dean of St. Tikhon Seminary. And you can see the room where he died. You can go there and pray in it. It's a really special place. Holy Hierarch Varnava Barnabas Nastich was born in Gary, Indiana, and lived his young life in America. And then his parents missed Sarajevo. They moved to Sarajevo. And then he was a confessor under the communists. He died, I think, in the 60s. But he spent many years in jail defending the Serbian Orthodox Church. Sire Martyr John, we know about him. Wonderful saint, died in 1964. Righteous Mother Olga, 1979. And then others to be canonized, perhaps in the future. Just to mention them briefly. Archbishop Arseny of Winnipeg in South Canaan. This is him in retirement. In retirement, he gave his life to St. Tikhon's as well, and was the dean there in the 40s until he died. And Metropolitan Leonti Turkevich, this is him and his family, this wonderful married priest who, when his wife died, they made him bishop and became Metropolitan of what became the OCA. He's just amazing. He was very smart too, very intelligent. Hieromonk Seraphim, Rose of Platina, certainly to be canonized in our lifetime, I think. Holy Father Seraphim. And then the Greeks have a lot of love for this Bishop Gerasimos Papadopoulos, who was spiritual father to Father George Wilson, and a great light among the Greeks, beloved by many, many people as a spiritual and holy person. He died in 1995. Among the greats of the last century, and to this one, is Archpriest George Calciu, who was a Romanian confessor under communism. He spent, along with his friend Father Roman Braga, many years in the Pitești concentration camp, and his life was basically forfeit, he thought, until he was released eventually. He came to America, where he served a Romanian Episcopal parish in D.C. for many years as a normal parish priest, but is widely considered a saint. They opened his coffin last year, and his body's incorrupt, so interestingly enough. Bishop Dimitri of Dallas, another picture of him baptizing the baby Oswald. There are already icons that have been made. I'm not a big fan of making icons of someone before they're canonized, but it happens, and there he is. And that picture over there is one you find on the internet a lot, and that one was taken in our parish back in 2006. His last visit was in 2006. The year, the visit that I became priest here, he installed me, and that was his final visit to St. Athanasius before he got too ill to travel. And this is Father Roman Braga, one of my favorite saints of the 20th century. Just a delightful man. Have you seen the video of him talking? Have anyone not seen it? Okay. I'll have to show it eventually. That's him. He spent 10 years in solitary confinement. And then Elder Ephraim of Arizona, highly beloved by the Greek community especially, and by lovers of monasticism. He's widely hailed as a holy man, and I don't see any reason why that's not true. So, now, our cathedral in Dallas. By the way, that little kid right there, that's JP, my oldest son. That's a long, this is Bishop Dimitri, one of his last ordinations before he retired. So.